Few things are as basic or important to life as our names, where we live, and what we eat and drink. The book of Daniel is famous for its dramatic stories and amazing visions, but it starts on a much more normal and relatable level, with a group of young friends grappling with life in a new city and new culture, and facing big issues around what to eat or drink. Daniel is a book of big questions, thrown up by the defeat and captivity of God's people. If everything goes wrong for them, what does that say about God? Is he still in control? Does he still reign? Does he still care? And those are questions which many, probably most of us, still ask when faced with things going wrong in the world around us. And you might think that God would answer them on a grand and cosmic scale. And if we read on in Daniel, he does. But first, he roots all those questions in the lives of 4 young men. And in doing so, he shows us that he's not just the God of nations and multitudes, but also the God of individuals, of you and me, and that he cares not just about the fate of nations, but also about you and me and what happens to us and how we live our lives. And that's one of the things I love about this book, that it manages to speak on both the grandest and smallest of scales. And as it tells us of these young men, it shows us so much not only about God, but also about us and what it looks like to live our lives for him. Samaya Asif is a teacher, and she and I met up to talk about living out our faith in the workplace. Thank you so much for meeting up.
Yeah, no problem.
Tell us a bit about you and your life and your work.
Yeah, so currently I'm working in a great school in Brighton. I'm a maths teacher. I teach secondary ages, so around ages 11 to 16. Early on in my career, it was evident that God has put me in this place for a reason, to pray for them, to be here speaking into their lives as much as I can.
You know a little bit about Daniel and his friends. What are you hoping you can learn from them?
A great question is, what does it look like for me to live out my faith in the different scenarios that I might face in a work day? For example, what does it look like for me to love someone when, a child is kicking off in the corridor? What does it look like if, I've had a bit of an awkward moment with a colleague? What does it look like if I'm surrounded by, colleagues on a Friday night and they're all gossiping about a certain person? What does it look like for me to actually show Jesus to them rather than join in with that situation? So yeah, I guess I'm just praying for that, praying for wisdom in that. How can I be a good ambassador for Christ in my workplace at the moment?
What are the challenges of working as a Christian in a secular environment?
The moment I became a Christian, I was very excited and keen to tell people about the experience that I had and about the God that I know and love and who loves me. Being in a setting as my school, I can't just share what I believe. So I think that's definitely a challenge.
And do you ever feel under pressure to sort of almost leave your faith at the door?
I think sometimes the things that we are being told to teach these young people go against what God says about them and what is in the Bible. So it can be very difficult in those times to know what to do, what to say, and have the wisdom to deal with that.
Daniel 1 is all about how 4 friends, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, begin to navigate life in a strange new context in Babylon. And it's clear from the outset that they were determined to put God at the heart of everything they did. which is amazing. The book opens with the trauma and shock of their exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, and they must have had so many questions and struggles. We know that they were the first in 2 or 3 waves of exile, all of which were part of God's wider judgment on Israel for their sins and rebellions against him. But would Daniel and his friends have known that then? And even if they did, they must still have wondered, why me? Why us? These 4 seem to have been some of the good guys, godly, faithful, committed, and yet they're the ones in exile while life continues back home as normal. Add in the difficulties and struggles of living life in a new and strange context, and you begin to see how lonely, hard, and painful this must have been for them. And yet that is the context in which they choose to put God first and live life for him. And so often in life and faith, we want things to be the other way round. We want God to answer all our questions first, to know how and why and how it's going to end. But it doesn't seem to work like that. Often God doesn't answer our questions or make things clear or show us how it will end. And yet he calls us to live for him even so in the midst of the confusion and brokenness of life, like Daniel and his friends. And I find their example so helpful and inspiring in that, because they show me what life is actually like. Not simple or easy or Instagrammable, but real. In some ways, Babylon is the archetypal place where God is not. Daniel and his friends are cut off from God's people and from the worship of the temple and all the rhythms and patterns of Old Testament faith. And yet, again and again, they discover that even there, God is with them and watching over them. Famously so, because that's what the grand stories of deliverance later in the book are partly about. God being with them and rescuing them, even from fiery furnaces and lions' dens and certain death. And yet, in some ways, the bits that hit home most for me are the smaller stories in chapter 1. God caused Daniel's boss to show him favor and compassion. And he gave knowledge and understanding to these 4 young men and seemingly watched over even their health and well-being. And those feel more like the sorts of things that our lives are about. Most of us don't face many life or death situations, but relationships with colleagues, doing our jobs well, or health and well-being are all things that we do grapple with every day. And God is with us too, even in moments and situations where we might not feel or expect it. Even more powerfully, actually, because as Christians, we can know a depth of relationship with God through his Holy Spirit beyond anything in the Old Testament. And so, even if life goes in directions we don't want, or we experience pain and heartache, we can know that God is and will be with us. And so there's a profound tension in Daniel. The 4 friends never discover why this happened to them, and they never get home. And so much of their life must have been tinged with sorrow and sadness. And yet they knew that God was with them even so, in the midst of their struggles and unanswered questions. And they saw the goodness and deliverance of God in small and crazy big ways. We often assume that it's either or, that if God is with us, then he'll always rescue us. Healing will come, our prayers will always be answered yes, and life will be easy. But Daniel shows us that it isn't like that. Life is both and, not either or. I love something Rick Warren said. Rather than life being hills and valleys, I believe it's kind of like 2 rails on a railroad track. And at all times you have something good and something bad. And so life with God is a story of both glory and struggle. And this story isn't just about inspiration and reassurance, but also challenge. Are you willing to trust and follow God, even through all the struggles and difficulties of life? If we are, Daniel has lots of resources and examples to help us work out what that looks like in practice. In chapter 1, we see the 4 friends figuring out life and with it a new work context in a confident and dominant culture with a different focus and different agenda to God's. which feels very familiar to our world today. The book's most famous for those moments when they say no to the world and culture around them. Starting here in chapter 1, where we read Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and climaxing in dramatic refusals of Daniel's friends to worship an image of gold set up by Nebuchadnezzar, and of Daniel to stop praying each day, despite threats and orders of execution. Clearly, this book shows us there are times when we need to say no to the demands of the people and cultures around us. And that can be in the details of life, as for them with what they eat and drink in chapter 1, or on the grandest of scales, moments quite literally of life and death. There's no detail too small to matter, but no price too big to pay. In everything, we always need to be willing and resolved to put God first, no matter what. And yet, just as important to the story of Daniel and his friends are the moments when they say yes to the world and culture around them. Starting with the biggest yes and decision of the whole book, their willingness to work at all for the regime in Babylon. After all, Babylon was a pagan empire ruled by a brutal king who would one day destroy Jerusalem and the temple. It's a strange thought that even as that happened, Daniel and his friends were working for Nebuchadnezzar back in Babylon. And for all the challenges and godlessness of Babylon, they realized that God was calling them to, as their contemporary Jeremiah would later put it, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. And I think there's something important here for us. We can often be tempted to withdraw from the world around us, to avoid schools or workplaces that aren't exactly as we want them to be. But Daniel's example reminds us of Jesus' call to be salt and light in the world, working for the peace and flourishing of our communities and workplaces. And so Daniel models both disengagement and engagement with the world around us. We're called to work for the good of the communities and companies where we find ourselves, even when there's lots wrong with them. And yet at the same time, always to put God first and be willing to say no when that first priority is challenged. As the book goes on, both elements only grow. Daniel is fully engaged, becoming a state governor and later prime minister, which is quite a career. And yet, right to the end, he's willing to give it all up and even face death in a lion's den, rather than compromise his faith. And that all prompts the question, when do I engage and when do I disengage? And this is where Daniel 1's example becomes a bit more complicated. One of the first things that we're told is that all four are given new names. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah become Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, that would be difficult for anyone, but for them there was an added religious dimension. Each Hebrew name actually said something about God. Daniel is, God is my judge. Hananiah, the Lord has been gracious, and so on. And each of their new names seems to have included a dedication to a foreign pagan god. Abednego is servant of Nebo, or Meshach, who is like Aku. Now, later in the chapter, they take a clear and bold stand against eating the king's food and wine. And I've often wondered why they don't do the same here. They can't have been happy about it, and yet they seem to let it happen. Why? And why not when it comes to the king's food and wine? I'd always assumed it was to do with it breaking Old Testament food laws. But there aren't any about wine, and yet they refuse that as well. I don't know, but the best guess I've heard is that it was something to do with the food and wine being dedicated to pagan gods. But I don't know, and I can't see why that's so much worse than you being dedicated to pagan gods through your name. So Daniel 1 seems clear that there are times when we need to say no and times we need to say yes, but less clear on helping us work out when and why. And I find that strangely encouraging. It reminds me that life is full of difficult decisions and situations. And often for many of us, it's not always clear what the right decision actually is. And I think this reminds us God knows that and calls us into those complicated places nonetheless, and crucially, will walk with us as we do. Living and working as a Christian isn't just about finding the right answers and then trying our best to do them. It's about walking with God and looking to Him to help us and lead us and sometimes forgive us through all life's ups and downs. One of the other features of Daniel's life is the way that he was proactive about this. There's lots of prayer in Daniel. He prays in crisis, he prays to ask for something, he prays when he needs wisdom or revelation. And undergirding it all, he prays 3 times every day. And alongside that, he clearly knew and prayed over the scriptures, quoting from Jeremiah at one point and Deuteronomy at another. His reliance on God isn't something that's just passive. He's actively seeking God's help and presence in his life. And if we want to flourish and live well for God, both in the workplace and more generally, then we need to be similarly proactive in prayer and scripture. What have you taken away from Daniel about how to live and work well?
I think one of the really encouraging things about the story of Daniel is that he lived and worked in a secular setting, and he was able to still be faithful to God as well as present in his work and where he was. I also love the fact that he didn't object to having his name changed, even though it was a pagan name. And, you know, it just makes me think that working in a secular setting isn't as always clear-cut. Also the fact that he was a praying man, he prayed. People knew that. People knew that he was a praying man, and as I walk into my room in the morning, I will just walk around and pray over the chairs, because I know there's over 150 students on some days that'll be sitting down on these chairs, and I just think no one else might be praying for them.
And if there was sort of one big takeaway, what would it be?
You know, there are ups and downs in your workplace, but we know for sure that, you know, God is with us. He is answering our prayers. We can call on Him whenever, for whatever, and yeah, that's a real blessing and a privilege as a Christian that we get to say that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
No problem, my pleasure.
And that's really the heart of what this book shows us about living life well. Life and work can be difficult and confusing, and following God doesn't just make it simple. But if we put God first in our hearts and our priorities, and we look to and we lean on Him, we can be confident that He will always be with us in it all.